Good morning, everybody. My name is Anders Edberg from IDC, and I will guide you through today's topic of running Kubernetes, managing Kubernetes. This is the first of a two series of webinars. We'll have another one next week where we'll talk about where to deploy your Kubernetes and the opportunities or possibilities of deploying at the edge. But today we're going to talk more about Kubernetes, containers, and so forth. And with me today, I have Rob Knight from SUSE, who will, after I've set the scene, will give more practical examples of how it's being used and give good advice on how you should address your Kubernetes strategy and your hands-on work with Kubernetes. And with that, I will just start off. As Thomas said, please write your questions, ideally in the Q&A session. If you do that, it will only be Rob and Thomas and I that can see your questions. If you write it in the chat, you can either write it directly to one of us or to us as a group, or you may post it to all of the participants at this call as well. But ideally, put it in the Q&A, and we'll address it as at the end of the session, even though you write the question in the middle of the presentation if you have something on your mind there. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the use of containers in the Benelux and the Nordics. And I did see on the delegate list that we have a few people that are not from this region. It just means that the data points that I show are basically from the Benelux and Nordics, but they honestly don't really differ that much from the overall European survey results and so on that we have. So the trends are the same, and you shouldn't leave just because you are not located in the Benelux or the Nordics. I'm sure you will get some value of it anyway. So I guess we've all heard multiple times from IDC and everyone else really about how the world is changing. Companies are becoming digital first. They need to, or on a process or a journey to modernizing the IT environment, that we could throw a lot of numbers about how prevalent those things are. But instead of reiterating that, I will just quickly show one of our prediction slides. IDC do, I have no clue about more than 100 predictions every year on specific technologies and industries and so forth. But one of the overarching ones is really that in 3 years' time, 40% of CIOs will not be able to deliver the requirements that the business has for the IT environments, and that just means that it is difficult. It's not just containers or any other technologies are not a silver bullet. You need to be aware of how you use it. You need to have a strategy for how you do it, how you build your infrastructure, the applications, how you modernize them, and all of that. And still, that may not be enough. But I guess that if the more if you listen to this, and if you are here now, I guess you do, then you'll have a better chance of not being among the 40s that fail. And of course, it's not a complete and utter failure that 40% will do, but they will have challenges really meeting the requirements. IDC has this framework, or what you want to call it, as we call the future of digital infrastructure. And that's really about how organizations should build their platform or infrastructure for a digital world. And I'll just very, very briefly go through it. It's about autonomous operations because of the requirements by the business, new requirements all the time, the requirements for being fast and agile and what have you. A lot of autonomous technologies need to be put in use. And that may be just shifting workloads automatically from one place to another. It may be in the application delivery cycles and so on. But really, a lot of autonomous technologies, a lot of AI have to be used in order to make sure that you can deliver on time. Then we have the deployment. So whether you deploy in the cloud, on the premise, on the edge, on premise, what have you, is also an important discussion that needs to be addressed. And we will talk more about that next week. But this week, today, we will talk more about the cloud native technologies. So what does that really mean for building this infrastructure? And I think we all have an idea about what cloud native technologies are, but there aren't any real set definitions. It's very much about what these technologies do rather than what they are. And it really is about technologies that support cloud nativity. So support this application delivery that is agile, constantly deployed, and all these different elements, the technologies that sits underneath that that are interesting. And some of the core elements of them are really about the programmable infrastructure. So everything software defined, whether it's software defined storage or it's containers, but really abstracting from the underlying infrastructure or hardware is really a core element of it. Then we have the API-centric deployments and development, and that is not just that, it's also really the whole architectural point of view with microservices, loosely coupled services, and all of these different elements that you do not have this monolithic application that just sits there, and you need to have a completely different approach to that. And then finally, it's about the multi-cloud management, so both that you can shift your workloads and your data between clouds depending on what's most feasible. It's also about leveraging the cloud services from a specific platform as a service, whether it's AWS or Azure or what have you, and you use them to the extent that it makes sense, and you can leverage different ones. And what we see here is about 65% have used these different elements to some degree. But we also see that the dark side of these charts are those that use it extensively, and those that are a lighter shade are those that only use it limited. So we actually see that for most organizations, they use these different ones, but only in a section of their IT environments. They're not full in on it. They're not use it that extensively. They use it in different places and for different purposes only. And of course, part of the programming infrastructure, core element of that is containers. So I'll dig into a little bit to what we see about that. And we see the same, or not the same, but we see that 28% use containers today. Strong interest in adopting, and virtually nobody has really decided against it. So this just shows that we have already as many that plan on adopting as those that use it currently. So there's of course a very strong interest right now. There's a big uptake in actually using these containers, and more interesting is possibly how they're being used and for what. Reflecting also the first or one of the previous slides where I said that it's being used to a limited degree only, specifically for containers. We see on that 70% of the respondents, they say that they run between 10 and 50% of their workloads in containers today. So again, that shows that it's been used quite a lot, but it's not a full stack transformation that the old legacy system has been containerized and all that. We are not at all there yet. We also see that containers are being used for different purposes. When we look at the applications and workloads that are put into containerized environments today, it's almost evenly split, but slightly more on net new applications. So the new applications typically focusing on customer experiences, digital business, and all these different elements make up for the largest portion of the applications that are being put into being containerized. We also see modernized, so existing applications that are modernized, containerized in order to get all of these different flexibility and so forth that we briefly talked about. But we also see 30% of the applications are actually unchanged. So it's just taking the old application, encapsulating it, containerizing it, and for management and orchestration purposes, or for compliance, or for other purposes, it is put into a container rather than running on a traditional infrastructure stack instead. So a lot of different use cases really that these can be used for, and I know Rob will talk more about specific use cases later on how they can be used. We also see that the containers run on multiple locations. It's not just something that runs in a cloud. It's on private on-premise equipment. It's on hosted environments. It's on public cloud. And as you can see, these are very high numbers, all of them. So it really just shows that the containers run across multiple locations. And we actually see about 2/3 of the respondents from this survey, they use all three different environments. And we could then add to this one, we could actually add containers at the edge, which we'll talk about next week. But really just that this is something that runs across different deployments. And that means, of course, you need to be able to manage it. You need to be very specific in terms of knowing what you deployed when and where all the time. And today we see that, again, resonating with the previous results, that 57% say that they only use containers for testing purposes and running test applications. A little more than 40% say that they have a production application running in containerized environments today. And if we look just a few years back, we see that it was virtually all in the on the test side. So we definitely see that production applications are moving in that direction as well. And that also means that you need, from a organizational point of view, figure out who should actually own the container management, the container orchestration part. As more and more applications in operations and in the production are being put in a container, do you need to? Does it still have to sit with the developers, which it very often do today, or should it move into the operations team, or do you need a infrastructure team or a platform team, a platform engineering team, whatever, that owns these different elements? That's, again, also something from a more organizational point of view that needs to be addressed when working with containers. What we see also is that, and this is not, these are split by the respondents that say that use it only in production, and those that use it in production, those in test only. It doesn't mean that, so those that use it in production evidently also use it to some extent, at least in test, at least I assume so. So it's not people that work, the respondent that work with it, with production responsibility or test responsibility. It's across the types of respondents in the survey. And if you look at the test first, we see that what they mainly see as the main benefits of using containers are really about the time of the faster application delivery. It's about the developer productivity. And then we see those that actually run it in production. They have much more, I would say, traditional infrastructure KPIs and more see that it actually also improves the stability, improves the security for the environment. But it also suggests actually that the very low part of application delivery time and developer productivity for those that use in production may be that there are other challenges in the application delivery, because if they run things in production, if they do not experience developer productivity as one of the benefits, then there may be some other problems in the delivery pipeline that needs to be addressed. And also, I think if we look at those that use it for test only, they may not always realize that there are additional benefits of running it in production beyond just the time to market. So I have to be, I guess, aware of some of these different benefits that can be achieved. And one of the, if we look at the challenges, because of course there are challenges with containers as well, it's not a silver bullet. Security, kind of course a challenge regardless of what we talk about with IT, that comes out of the first. But otherwise we see that the top ones on the list are the most prevalent challenges. They are about management. So it's about data management, moving workloads and data across clouds. It's about using modern databases, all of these data-related issues and managing and orchestration issues. And that really means that there needs to be a more management possibilities than just a typical Kubernetes or other platform setup. And that's why we see a lot of interest in container management platforms, where you manage the Kubernetes cluster rather than the individual containers and so forth. We see most of those, or about half of those that use containers today, also use a container management platform, and the rest more or less expect to use it. If I also included those that expect to start using containers but do not use it today, we actually see, I think it's about 80% of those that expect to use container management platform as well. So we definitely see that that will go more and more mainstream in the coming years. And if we then look at what is it that these platforms should deliver, it really is first and foremost about functionality. Yes, it has to be secure. Yes, well, it doesn't have to be the cheapest one, but at least it can't be too expensive, because then it's disqualified from being used. But if we disregard those two things, it's about feature richness. It's about the ability to integrate with easily. It's about ease of use. We also have managed services, but the focus is really first and foremost about the functionality that it needs to provide and needs to be able to how you actually need to be able to use it. And then the some of the other ones come later here. You can see that on the slide. And with that, I will actually hand over to Rob to say a little bit more about how he sees containers and Kubernetes, and also how whether Rancher, which is SUSE's management platform, whether that meets the challenges that I just emphasized here. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much, Anders, for that warm introduction and that great insight that you've just given all of us here. I know I learned a couple of things in there as well. Hi everyone, my name is Rob Knight and I'm the CTO of Enterprise Cloud Products at SUSE. I spend my days talking to our customers and partners to see how they can implement a successful cloud native strategy with containers. I'm going to share my screen now as we go through some slides. I wanted very quickly to give a little introduction to SUSE for those who aren't aware of us. Traditionally, we've been known for our enterprise operating system, SLES, but as the years have moved on, we've branched out into other software-defined infrastructure areas. And with our recent acquisition of Rancher Labs and NuVector, we're now well positioned to provide that full enterprise container stack that, as Anders alluded to, is such a high priority for a lot of enterprises today. But if we take a quick look at why we care about Kubernetes management, why is a container management platform important? As we embrace containers, which are a great way to develop and deliver software, we soon run into some problems, right? We need to ensure that the right container is running in the right place at the right time and has all of the dependencies that it needs in terms of infrastructure. So has it got the right storage? Is there a load balancer present? And all of that fun stuff. And this is where Kubernetes comes in. Kubernetes allows us to automate and orchestrate all of those various components so that we can manage thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of containers across multiple environments. And as time has gone on, more and more workloads are being brought into the Kubernetes management framework, such as virtual machines and storage appliances now as well can all be managed through that same Kubernetes orchestration engine. And when we look at why a container management platform is so important, there are a few reasons why these management platforms are taking over the industry, really. We know that Kubernetes currently is the de facto container management platform. And so we need a way that we can embrace Kubernetes in a way which enables innovation and modernization. And a good container management platform can help us achieve that. It should also support, as Anders said, our ambitions towards hybrid cloud as well. We fully recognize at SUSE, it's our heritage that there's a lot of legacy workloads out there. We're not able to suddenly take all of those and run them on the cloud. So we need a good container management platform that can mesh the legacy with the modern in a way that makes it easier for your teams to consume IT. Platforms like Kubernetes also help us drive towards an API native world. We've seen more and more industries, and we use the example of open banking in finance, embrace API native development, and Kubernetes can help us embrace that. So we need to be able to manage Kubernetes in a way that also embraces that API native model. Almost every customer partner that I speak to today in some way is considering how they're going to implement Kubernetes or how they're going to implement it at their customer sites. So the simple reason of why should you be interested in this? Well, because your competition likely is. So thinking about your enterprise container strategy early on is very key in order to ensure success. When organizations first started deploying Kubernetes, I was there back in 2014, 2015. Early adopters, they began deploying Kubernetes in the same way that they had their traditional infrastructure. They would build large monolithic clusters, but they quickly learned from those experiences. They learned that it can be quite hard to scale when you have these huge clusters. It can be quite hard to adapt your Kubernetes infrastructure if you have monolithic large clusters. Different workloads have different needs. For example, an AI/ML-based app is going to have completely different infrastructure requirements to a line of business application. And being able to accommodate all of these different types of apps within one large, huge cluster it can be quite challenging. So the reality is that there is a well-defined need to be able to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters at scale so that you can deploy the right cluster from the right vendor, from the right open source community for the right workload. But also there needs to be an effective way to manage all of these clusters. As we move to a multi-cluster world, we want to prevent cluster sprawl. You need to ensure that you still have that insight, that you still have that security across all of your different Kubernetes clusters. And this is where Kubernetes management comes in and where it shines. With Kubernetes management, you can have a consistent interface to all of your clusters wherever they are running. You can also work with a combination of different clusters from different suppliers, different communities, serving different use cases as well. But bringing effective Kubernetes management to the table means that you have control over all of those clusters as well. I like to say that it can contain the chaos that Kubernetes can sometimes bring into an IT operations environment. There are so many different Kubernetes distributions out there today. There's also a few different Kubernetes management platforms as well. So I want to talk a bit about what I feel is an ideal Kubernetes management platform and how we at SUSE approach some of these challenges and ideas as well. I'm going to group this by these four main themes that are on the screen now. And the first one is that it is a multi-cluster world. As I just talked about there, the value is no longer just in the Kubernetes distribution, it's in how we manage these different distributions. And at SUSE Rancher, we've pioneered multi-cluster management for more than 4 years now. We've also seen a lot of the competition start to catch up with technologies like OpenShift ACM and Tanzu, embracing this multi-cluster model so that you can deploy different clusters for different use cases. These days, Kubernetes distributions are commoditized. The argument that one distribution is better or worse than another doesn't hold as much water as it did 2 or 3 years ago. And that's because the value is in Kubernetes management. How do you bring all of your clusters under a single management plane of control? When we deploy multiple clusters to different environments, we need to be able to centrally manage them. We need to be able to deploy centralized authentication. We need to be able to enforce centralized security policies. Anders just mentioned how security is top of the CIO's mind. We need to bring all of those benefits to our Kubernetes landscape. And that's why the approach that we take at SUSE with SUSE Rancher is supporting any CNCF certified Kubernetes distribution. We like to think that this brings a more open approach to open source. We don't care whether you've deployed a Kubernetes distribution from us or from one of our competitors or one from the open source ecosystem. As long as it works within that CNCF well-defined certification structure, we're able to manage it in exactly the same way. And we believe that this is the right approach so that you can choose the right distribution for each specific use case. If you want to run clusters running natively on AKS, Azure Cloud Kubernetes, that's absolutely fine. You can manage them in exactly the same way as you manage your on-premise clusters. Of course, we'd love it if you use SUSE throughout the entire stack, that would be awesome, but we don't lock you into that approach. It gives you that kind of complete freedom as well. Kubernetes initially had a strong element of avoiding vendor lock-in. And over time, some distributions have tended to lock our customers into the different distributions that they offer. There'll be features only available on a specific distribution or platform as a service technologies that are purely designed to lock you in. But if you embrace effective Kubernetes management, you can release yourself from those burdens because you've got an additional layer above your clusters that acts as that central source of truth for everything. Now, I mentioned SUSE Rancher just now, and that is our main open source Kubernetes management offering. And the reason that I stress that open source is that obviously we do have paying customers for SUSE Rancher, but they download exactly the same bits that your teams are able to go and download today. You're able to go off to our GitHub repository and get started with exactly the same code base. Our customers, they just pay us for support and on occasion, the professional services and consulting subscriptions. And I think this is important because it allows you to get started with the value of Kubernetes management today for free. There's just that initial time investment from your teams. When we talk about the Kubernetes layer, we do have a couple of distributions ourselves. RKE, which is designed for the data center and for the cloud. We also have K3S as well, which is optimized for edge use cases. And you're going to hear a lot more about K3S next week, so I won't talk about it today. When it comes to centralized management, we like to bring full lifecycle management to your clusters, whether they are SUSE deployed clusters or whether they're running on EKS, AKS, or GKE. What I mean by that is it's not just a case of building the cluster. How do we monitor that cluster? How do we upgrade the cluster to the next version of Kubernetes when it gets released? You're able to manage and control all of that from that single pane of glass offered by SUSE Rancher. Now, if we have a quick whiteboard architecture of what a Kubernetes management platform such as SUSE Rancher looks like within your overall Kubernetes estate, SUSE Rancher can be deployed on any Kubernetes cluster of your choice. It runs on top of Kubernetes to gain those high availability benefits and infrastructure benefits that Kubernetes brings. Once SUSE Rancher has been deployed, the next step is adding clusters for SUSE to manage. Now, as I mentioned, these can be SUSE provided clusters, or these can be clusters from other vendors or from the upstream community. You can import clusters that you've built perhaps a year or so ago into that management framework, or you can deploy new ones using the SUSE Rancher UI or API as well. And once those clusters are provisioned or imported, we then give you the capability with SUSE Rancher to manage those clusters, to bring that centralized authentication, that centralized policy and governance, to manage the lifecycle of the apps that you deploy on the clusters, but also to give your teams more insight into the clusters and into the workloads running on those clusters as well. But most importantly, we understand that a lot of Kubernetes management projects, they're not greenfield deployments. They need to integrate with your existing technology stack, with your existing monitoring, with your existing logging as well. And that's why all of those features come out of the box with SUSE Rancher to integrate with your traditional stack as well. When it comes to cluster operations and management, there's a quick screenshot of it there. What we're talking about is provisioning Kubernetes distributions, provisioning those clusters. It can go off and talk to your cloud provider's API and then bootstrap new clusters or upgrade existing clusters. And this is quite important because when we're talking about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, you don't want your teams to have to learn all the different APIs provided by all the different cloud vendors. Each one runs slightly differently. We abstract those underlying APIs so that all your teams need to learn is the SUSE Rancher Web UI or our powerful CLI or API as well. By abstracting those clouds, when they release new versions or when they have changes to your API, your teams don't need to keep track because we take care of that for you as well. As talked about already briefly about security, being able to have centralized authentication for hundreds of different Kubernetes clusters running in any environment is really quite powerful. With a couple of clicks, you can integrate with Azure AD or Okta all of your clusters, whether those clusters you've built with SUSE Rancher or clusters that you've deployed from another vendor and have imported into that Kubernetes management platform that we offer. This was really powerful because this would take hours, if not days, to do with traditional sysadmin tooling. We also implement various hardening templates and SIS benchmark compliance scans for all of those downstream clusters as well. It's also key to provide value to your DevOps teams as well, and this is why we provide the Cluster Explorer. When first getting started with Kubernetes, there is an initial uphill learning curve. So having a nice UI that's user and developer friendly can help reduce that initial burden. So it's a GUI to manage the workloads that your teams are deploying on top of clusters. There's an application catalog, making it easy for you to deploy apps provided either by SUSE ourselves or by a number of our trusted third parties, or via apps that you have developed yourselves and published in the catalog. But it doesn't just stop at the catalog. There's a number of integrations that are on offer, as there should be with any enterprise Kubernetes management platform. I touched earlier about choice, giving you the freedom to choose what software runs on your cluster for the right job, and that is so important. So supporting all of these best of breed open source tools, all part of the CNCF landscape, is really key to our strategy, just so that you've got that freedom of choice. So when it comes to a Kubernetes management platform, it sits on top of your Kubernetes clusters. It can help with your DevOps automation. It can help with your security. It can help manage your existing infrastructure as well. I mentioned earlier on when we talked about legacy infrastructure, that it's no longer a case that things are just greenfield deployments. We ran a survey relatively recently, and among our customers and people that we interviewed, 71% are running containers and Kubernetes on-premise and 67% in the cloud. A lot of vendors often only think about things in terms of the cloud. How can I get stuff running on the public cloud? But the reality is, for a lot of enterprises, is that hybrid approach. And for many, there's still a hell of a lot of on-premise environments. So I really want to stress that when thinking about your enterprise Kubernetes management strategy, you need a Kubernetes management tool that handles on-premise clusters as first-class citizens. You should be able to manage those on-premise clusters in the same way, with that same flexibility and ease of use as you get from the cloud. I just want to talk about a couple of success stories. And the first one that we're really proud of is ABSA. Now, they've achieved huge reduction in overhead costs by embracing SUSE Rancher management technology. When we're talking about ABSA, they're obviously a bank, huge in South Africa, but also globally. They've deployed SUSE Rancher to all of their branch locations. So whereas before they would have to pre-configure systems at their central office, ship them out with an engineer, you would then have to do a bunch of on-site configuration, they're able to just ship blank boxes that can then pixie boot, install everything over the network, and then their ops team can manage everything centrally. It's also helped advance their drive towards more cloud-native microservices technologies. They said that this was especially useful during the pandemic, when their team suddenly had to innovate and create a lot of new apps and services to support more remote banking and banking from home, as well as support all their employees that are now working from home as well. We've talked a lot about hybrid today as well, and a great example of that is Disney, where they've used SUSE Rancher technology initially within their movie marketing team. But as they started to realize the value of Kubernetes management, they expanded that elsewhere to their parks in 2018. They've now also expanded that onto their ships. And I think that this is really quite key, because today you may think, well, this isn't relevant for me. I'm not thinking about edge technologies. I'm not thinking about AI ML. I don't operate a cruise line. But you don't know what your use cases are going to be tomorrow. You don't know how your requirements are going to change over time. So having a software stack that is flexible, that supports that hybrid mentality, and that can run anywhere is really quite key, because you don't want to lock yourselves into a Kubernetes management strategy or vendor that doesn't have that same level of flexibility. You should be able to run and manage Kubernetes wherever that Kubernetes is run, from the public cloud to on-premise. We've even got some customers that are using it in satellites and on airplanes as well. So having that central point of management for Kubernetes wherever it runs can bring significant benefits. So I'd implore you just to have an open mind when thinking about your Kubernetes management strategy. Think outside the box. What am I going to need in 3, 5, 10 years' time? And then embrace those technologies today so that you're prepared for the future as well. Just quickly, before I sign up and we go over to the questions, we are working on a number of other open source projects. Now, if any of you are already developing with containers, your teams possibly have used the Docker desktop application, and Docker recently announced a licensing change. So any large enterprise can no longer use Docker desktop for free. So I really want to highlight Rancher Desktop. Rancher Desktop is designed as a drop-in replacement for Docker Desktop, allowing your developers to continue developing locally on their local machines. Although we switched out the Docker engine with Containerd and Kubernetes, we provide compatibility binaries, so all of your existing commands work in exactly the same way. We're also innovating to make the developer experience on top of Kubernetes easier. I talked earlier on about that steep learning curve that's there. And for that, we have Opinio, which is a more opinionated platform as a service technology, allowing your developers to go from code to app in one step. For those of you who are familiar or have used Cloud Foundry before, it's a similar kind of concept in principle, just a lot more lightweight. It can run on your own local laptop, and it's Kubernetes native as well. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. We're going to head over to the questions section now, but I do encourage you all to read the materials that will get emailed out to you as follow-up, and don't hesitate to reach out to any of us at SUSE at any time if you have any of your questions. We can set up personalized demos, we can help work with you on a proof of concept as well, but also just to answer any general questions you have about these technologies or how they could fit into your overall enterprise IT strategy. So with that, I'll hand back to Thomas and Anders.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think we should just head over to the Q&A. And while we wait for the questions to come in, there's actually one thing I thought about and actually also talked about very briefly earlier. It's almost exactly a year since SUSE acquired Rancher, and there were, as usual, some discussions about what would it do with Rancher, or even though it's still in the what you call open source domain, or what you want to call it, will it have any? Will there be any implications in cultural clashes or anything? So how has the last year been in terms of integrating Rancher and working for that?
Yeah, it's been a really fun year, and that's a great question, Anders. And you're right, there was initially some concern in the market, right? Is SUSE going to kind of change what Rancher is about? How are they going to integrate them? Because, you know, sometimes in open source, there's acquisitions that kind of don't go that way. However, right from the outset, right from when we were doing the due diligence, SUSE and Rancher's approach to open source has been completely aligned. It's almost a perfect fit in that regard. They would have all left if we'd have tried to do any of those nasty changes that people try to imply. And conversely, it's not just about SUSE acquiring a technology. It's about SUSE thinking about how we innovate and how we develop products going forward as well. So being able to infuse the agility that Rancher team had proven themselves to have into the wider SUSE organization has been really quite fun. And although, yes, integrations, they can take time, and sometimes they can be painful as well. But from my personal perspective, we've not experienced a lot of friction. The teams have integrated well quite quickly. They all get along amazingly well. We are all one team now. And as you saw on that slide I just showed there around our new open source innovations, innovation at SUSE has sped up 10-20-fold since we've brought the Rancher team on board as well. And we've also recently just announced our acquisition of NeuVector. They are huge players in the Kubernetes and cloud native security space. So that kind of completes the pie for our customers, really. So we had our traditional Linux, which we were great and well known for. We've now embraced the cloud native world with Rancher. And as you mentioned earlier, security, that huge hot piece top of CIO's mind. We've now got that with NeuVector to complete the stack as well. And it's a really exciting time to be at SUSE.
Sounds great. And thank you for that. There is also a question, I think, from Thomas, is just how will Kubernetes be successful across my organization? That's a very, very big question. We could almost start over trying to answer it again. But I think, just briefly from my point of view, I think it's really about first figuring out what is it actually want, making sure that it's aligned with the business, and then understanding the complete possibilities, making sure, as you also, I think we actually both mentioned that, Rob, talk about both the legacy and the integration to the existing stuff, and not just look at as the greenfield or the new fancy IT that's built in there. And then I think it's also about, of course, you mentioned the learning curve, making sure that you have the skills. We see that as I think that was on one of my slides as well, as one of the main challenges, really making sure that you have the right skills, and if you don't, then making sure that you either get them or team up with a services provider that can help you on that. I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on that, Rob.
I think that covers the key points. You're absolutely right. In order to build an effective Kubernetes strategy, you need to understand what the current state of container adoption within your organization is today. You know, is it primarily used by your apps or your DevOps team? Are they already using containers to accelerate the development pipeline? Because they might already be using Kubernetes technologies under the hood. And once you've done that, you can then work with innovation groups. You can set up those teams internally to kind of spread the good word about Kubernetes throughout the organization, while still recognizing that it's still popular to use a lot of different tools as well. You know, I talked earlier on about how you've got to use the right tool for the right job. It's not just about moving everything over at once. And to touch on your point about training as well, we see that all the time with our customers. And that's why we have countless hours of free training resources available for Kubernetes developers, as well as for the operations team as well. If you just head to rancher.com/training, there's so much there available completely for free. We also run the Rancher Rodeos, which can take someone from building their first container through to deploying a web app on top of Kubernetes with all the associated services as well. Those are webinars, and there's also in-person training, all completely free, because we see that skills gap as well, and we want to try and address it as best we can. So I do encourage teams to check that out.
Yeah, and I think that's just on top of that's actually important for enterprises or companies to make sure that both you and also other players out there have a lot of material available and making sure to utilize it. Just pointing to the fact that you can go here and train yourself, that doesn't really catch on if you just do that.
Yep.
Another question here about where would you physically place the Kubernetes management platform for hybrid deployments? Would it be in the edge, in the cloud, on-premise? Are there any? I guess I would use my analyst answer, which is it depends. But I guess Rob, you can elaborate a little bit on that as well.
So, and that is in many ways the right answer. It does depend. Although out of the three options given, I would advise avoiding deploying the management platform at the edge, because the management platform is meant to be kind of core to the whole Kubernetes infrastructure. It talks out to those edge devices to manage the workloads on there and manage the clusters that are running out on the edge. The last thing you want is network connectivity issues, stopping clusters from being able to talk to your management server. So deploy your management platform at the core. Now, the core for your team and your company may be on premise, it may be in the cloud. A lot of our customers will deploy their management platform in their data center so that they've got that bit of extra control around it, and then have it reach out to the cloud and reach out to the edge. But it's equally as appropriate to deploy it in the public cloud as well, where you can grow that management infrastructure, because over time you're going to need more and more, and it might be easier for you to grow that in the cloud. So it does depend, as Anders say, but I'd recommend deploying the management control plane at the edge.
Thank you. There's another question here about who should be responsible for the Kubernetes. And I think I've briefly talked about, and you also talked about developers versus operations. And as we see that it becomes more and more the de facto standard, if you want to call it that, for infrastructures, then it could be more relevant to put it with the responsibility with the infrastructure team rather than the developer team. And we'll also talk about if the developers are, if you actually end up hurting the productivity by giving them responsibility for too many non-development tasks. We'll talk about developer cognitive load and what have you. But and again, to some extent, the answer, I guess, is it depends on where you are in the journey, how many clusters you're managing, and how big a team you actually have. But do you have any golden rules or rules of thumbs or anything for
Yeah.
own it?
Yeah. So I think 3 or 4 years ago, when we was talking about Kubernetes to our customers, I was always talking to the developers. Those were the teams that were asking for it. Those were the teams that we were able to engage with. Fast forward to 2021, and we're getting calls daily from ops managers, almost in desperation of, I need a Kubernetes platform. I need to get this running because my developers now need it because they've become dependent on it, or because I see the value that it's going to bring to our business. I do firmly believe that it should be the IT ops team that owns the management platform, that owns the Kubernetes strategy, because at the end of the day, it's an operating platform. Just like they owned the Linux distribution and the server racks of the past, they need to own that underlying platform of what happens today and going into the future as well. They should also, and this is one, I guess, difference from in the past. In the past, things were quite locked down. And over time, we've moved more towards a self-service architecture. A decent Kubernetes management platform enables self-service so that you can give your developers the right resources and permissions to build their clusters. They don't need to manage those clusters because the platform takes care of managing it, but they need to be able to build and innovate on those clusters. But it's 100% needs to be in the IT ops team, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just encourage everyone, if you have more questions, just write them. If not, I actually have another one for you, Rob, that I think could be relevant, because we've now talked about who should own the Kubernetes. I tried to start at the top about talking about the business and how this really how to support the business where you want to take your business. You may need to, or you will need to set the right infrastructure and the right platform, and in essence containers and Kubernetes and what have you. And you already showed a list of different SUSE projects. So can you maybe say something about how you would make sure that the Kubernetes and the Rancher would get the business impact, whether it's through KPIs, or if it's how you would communicate it, how you would proactively promote it in the organization to make sure that the business take full advantage of it?
Yeah, and when it comes to that question of internal adoption, we almost pose a question back, right? How does Kubernetes management fit in with your other major initiatives? A lot of companies now have a cloud-first strategy. A lot of them also have a hybrid or multi-cloud strategy as well. And because these container use cases can fulfill all of those requirements, it's about figuring out where they fit for all of those different those different use cases. But what we've also found with customers of ours in the past is sometimes it'll take one team that goes on this journey, and when they start realizing the benefits of containers and Kubernetes management platforms, they see the benefits, and other departments, other parts of the organization want in on that action as well. But when that time comes that they are shouting from the rooftops and other teams want to get in on the action, you need to make sure, as we talked about earlier, that the right training is in place. Have you got the right resources? Have you got the right training partner in place to help onboard those other teams effectively as well? So when talking about broader adoption, learning curve is by far, in my opinion, the steepest barrier to wider adoption within the org. So addressing that can really help with that. And Kubernetes use does tend to organically grow within an organization because the benefits are so strong.
Yeah, and I think your Disney case was a good example of that. It started somewhere, and then kind of the rings in the water spread to more use cases. Because I think also that in order to get started on this, which is for many organizations may also be a challenge, is really to have the use case and focus. If you just say that we want to containerize our entire IT environment, then you should probably take the elephant one slice at a time, eat the elephant one slice at a time, or whatever you say. So if you are completely new to this, Rob, how would you then? What do you think that people should focus on? Are there any specific projects where they will see a quick payoff, or that are easy ways to get started?
Yeah, there usually is some low-hanging fruit, as we would say, right? Some project that is perhaps small is relatively low risk as well, because you're learning new technologies. You don't want to suddenly be throwing all of that at your most critical application. But there's also likely to be a project where, although it's relatively low risk, the potential impact or value is quite high. And I completely agree. Going in and saying we're going to take all of our existing estate and run it in containers is not going to work. There's not many companies that should even attempt to do that kind of thing. So you should conduct an analysis. What IT apps do you have today? How could they be improved? Would there be any benefit to modernizing them to be in a more cloud native format? And also, how do I modernize them? Some apps you might have to redevelop from the ground up. Some apps, just minor tweaks and changes to then be able to migrate into containers and on top of Kubernetes. And those latter apps, I think those are the low-hanging fruit. Apps where it's not going to require a huge amount of effort to modernize them. Apps where it's low risk. If something weren't to go as you planned, it's not going to cause significant loss to the business. And those are also good apps for your teams to start playing with as well, where they can start learning these technologies as well. But it really is, again, as we said earlier, it depends entirely on your business and entirely what apps you've got running. And I think it's at that point is when you do contact someone such as ourselves, because we can, go on that analysis journey with you. We can go through that proof of concept with you to make sure that you're targeting the right app and the right use case.
Great. Thank you, Rob. I don't see any more questions coming in. We do still have, I think, 4 minutes compared to the time schedule, but are there anything that either I or the participants this morning has forgotten to answer or to ask us. Are there anything anything that really, I assume you would have had it in your slides, but are there anything else really that you sit on that you say that I just need to get this out before to the audience before wrapping up?
Yeah, I think it's a question that I get a lot at events and a lot from customers and partners, which when talking about a Kubernetes strategy, they often ask, what are my options? You know, what is out there? Because obviously I'm here talking about SUSE Rancher, but are there other approaches? And it would be wrong for us not to mention them. I think there's three kind of main approaches. You can build it yourself. You can use open source projects that are out there, or you can use commercial products. Talking about the first one, you can build it yourself. That's traditionally what people were doing back in 2014, 2015. You have complete customization, which is a bonus, of course, but it's often a mix of automation, tools written in-house, homegrown scripts that sometimes can be a nightmare to manage. And then if the person that built that automation leaves, you're kind of in hot water then, because you know you've not got the support available for that. So although building it yourself does work for some companies, my recommendation is the majority don't. Then that second option, using open source projects that are out there. Obviously, I've already mentioned SUSE Rancher, definitely the number one in terms of downloads for open source projects for Kubernetes management, but there are other ones as well, DCOS, for example. I think Red Hat has one as well. So you can use those open source projects, and that is how many customers often get started with Kubernetes management, just going and grabbing the code from GitHub. That is often great for perhaps smaller companies or companies that have lots of Linux and Kubernetes knowledge in-house. But soon enough, a problem's going to happen. Soon enough, there's going to be a cluster that falls over, and you need someone to pick up the phone to call for help. You know, that's what our bread and butter is. That's what Red Hat's bread and butter is, and all the other enterprise vendors' bread and butter is being that insurance policy for when something goes wrong that you can call to get things fixed quickly. And that's why, especially for larger enterprises, medium enterprises, going the commercial product route is, I think, quite important. Obviously, I would say that working for SUSE, but to have that support, I've seen what happens when you don't and things go wrong, and it's not pretty, especially with new technologies and new platforms. So having that reassurance that there's someone at the end of the phone that you can call is something that brings a lot of value to our customers, and that's why so many people do choose to pay for SUSE Rancher, even though they can get the same product for free from GitHub.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, because in one of our recent open source surveys, not specifically for Rancher, but for different open source projects we looked at there, I think it was 75–80% of organizations say that they buy the commercial support as well. And it is the insurance, it is the potential cost of being alone with it, having no one to call or no one to blame if it doesn't work. Just one question actually came in about the network dependencies related to this. Yeah.
So I believe that was when I was talking about not deploying your management platform at the edge. And I said that because your Kubernetes management platform, such as SUSE Rancher, is the platform that talks to all of your other clusters, and it's the one that controls and orchestrates all of those downstream clusters. So you don't want that to be at an edge location, because for many edge locations, you may have limited bandwidth, you might have connectivity issues. You want your management server to be able to talk to all of your clusters with decent links. That's what I was inferring by that. Of course, if the link does go down, that's fine. It's not going to destroy your clusters. Kubernetes will keep chugging in the background, but those issues are more likely to happen in our experience at those far edge locations than they are in your data center or in the public cloud.
Yes, thank you. And I think that was actually a great way of closing for today, as the session on Tuesday next week is actually about Edge and what to be aware of there and what to focus on. So with that, I will thank you very much for joining, and hope to see you next Tuesday. And should you have any follow-up questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. And otherwise, you will get an email with a recording of today's session, as well as the slide decks. So hope to hear from you again, and thank you very much.